Rapunzel Rewritten by Nariah, Sukhi, and Juan. Once upon a time, there was a girl named Rapunzel, who lived high in a tower hidden in the woods. Her hair was long and golden, and her heart held an inexplicable yearning for freedom. But that yearning was tangled with another, strong emotion, an ever-present, overwhelming fear that clung to her every thought. Rapunzel had a deep-rooted social anxiety disorder, one that filled her with dread whenever she thought about the world outside. Every day, Rapunzel watched the floating lights rise into the sky from her window. Her heart ached with a longing she could barely understand. Yet, every time she considered the idea of leaving her tower, her stomach churned, her heart raced, and she felt a tightening in her throat that made breathing difficult. The world outside was filled with unknown faces, people who might judge her, laugh at her, or simply expect her to speak, to be someone she wasn't sure she could be. So day after day, she stayed in the tower, under the protective watch of her mother, Gothel. Gothel, though not a true mother, had taken Rapunzel under her wing, convincing her that the world outside was dangerous. But her warnings didn't focus on wolves or bandits. Instead, she emphasized the people. "They'll mock you, Rapunzel," she'd whisper. "They'll see right through you." Rapunzel's anxiety was her tether and her prison, and Gothel exploited it, using words to reinforce Rapunzel's fears. For Rapunzel, socializing wasn't just hard, it felt impossible. One day, a young man named Flynn Rider stumbled into her tower, wounded and disoriented after a run-in with the royal guards. Rapunzel, terrified at the sight of a stranger in her safe space, shrank into the shadows, her heart racing as if it would break free off her chest. She felt dizzy, her palms clammy, and her mind clouded with panic. What would he think of her? Would he laugh at her for hiding? What if he was dangerous? But Flynn was more interested in hiding than making conversation, and his casual attitude gave Rapunzel a tiny spark of courage. For the first time, she found herself talking to someone other than her mother. Her voice shook as she spoke, her hands fidgeting, and her eyes rarely left the floor. But Flynn didn't seem to mind. He made jokes, laughed at his own clumsiness, and acted as though they'd known each other for years. His relaxed nature eased some of the weight pressing on her chest, allowing her to speak more freely, even if her voice still quivered and she felt a lump in her throat each time she met his eyes. Rapunzel wanted Flynn to take her to see the floating lights, but the idea of leaving the tower, of facing a world full of people, triggered a whirlwind of anxiety. Her symptoms became intense. Rapid heartbeat, nausea, cold sweats. She still yearned to see the lights, to know what was out there, to push against the boundaries her mother and her own mind had created. Flynn noticed her hesitation. "Are you okay?" he asked, his brow furrowing. Rapunzel tried to explain, fumbling for words, her thoughts tangled in fears and insecurities. She explained how she felt like her mind was its own cage, holding her back with fears that others might see her panic, might judge her for it, or might simply see her as strange. Flynn didn't judge her. Instead, he offered a small, empathetic smile. "You're not alone in that," he said softly. "A lot of people feel nervous around others. It's not easy to face that." With his gentle encouragement and understanding, Rapunzel took her first shaky steps off the tower. Her heart pounded, and she felt exposed, raw, as if every stranger they passed could see her anxiety written across her face. She used grounding techniques Flynn had taught her, taking deep breaths, counting backwards from 10, and focusing on the sounds around her to steady her nerves. And slowly, she found herself able to breathe through her panic, to feel a little less trapped by her fear. At the village, Rapunzel's symptoms surged as she became surrounded by people. Her chest tightened, and her legs threatened to give out under her. The crowd's voices blurred together, each sound amplifying her anxiety, until it felt like it was consuming her. She felt overwhelmed, like the world was spinning out of control. Tears pricked her eyes, and she gripped Flynn's hand for stability, the anchor that kept her from being swept away. Flynn guided her to a quieter corner, speaking in a calm, low voice that helped ground her. He reminded her to focus on her breathing, to remember that no one was judging her, and that if she needed to retreat, that was okay too. With his gentle reassurance, Rapunzel gradually felt her racing heart begin to slow. She realized that her anxiety might not disappear, that she might always carry it with her like an invisible burden, but she didn't have to let it rule her. Each step was a small act of bravery, each breath a reminder that she was stronger than she thought. When Rapunzel finally reached the place where the floating lights rose into the night sky, her heart was still thudding, and her hands still shook, but she felt something she'd rarely felt before, a calm, fragile happiness. The lights were beautiful, illuminating the night in soft, warm colors, and for a moment, she allowed herself to feel the beauty around her without letting her anxiety steal the moment. Flynn sat beside her, watching her face rather than the lights. "You did it," he whispered, smiling. "I know it wasn't easy." "It wasn't," Rapunzel admitted, surprised at her own honesty. She had spent so much time hiding her anxiety, fearing what others might think if they knew about her struggles. But Flynn had shown her that the vulnerability wasn't a weakness. Her anxiety didn't define her. It was only a part of her, one that she could learn to navigate and live with. Eventually, Rapunzel returned to the tower to confront Gothel, not just for herself, but to reclaim her sense of independence. This time, she wasn't just battling her mother's manipulative words, but her own inner fears. Gothel tried to convince her that the world was too much for her, and that her anxiety was proof that she didn't belong out there. But Rapunzel had seen the lights. She'd faced the fears, struggled through her panic, and still managed to find beauty in the world. She didn't need to be fearless, she just needed to be brave enough to take one step at a time. Rapunzel's journey didn't end with a complete cure. Her anxiety remained, a quiet presence in the back of her mind. Some days were harder than others, filled with symptoms that made her feel trapped. But now, she knew that she had an understanding of her limits. She could face the world on her terms, with Flynn and others who accepted her as she was. The end.